I'm just setting up my recording, and I'm going to give it another minute or so for people to pull in. I think I'll also put my camera on for a while. I probably won't keep it on for the whole time because my internet's been a bit wobbly today. So if that happens, I will switch off to preserve bandwidth. Um, This is a Q&A session, so I don't have material prepared. I'm going to work off the questions you give me and show you like my response in real time. So this isn't something I've practiced. It can't be something I've practiced. I'm probably going to make mistakes, and that's going to be part of the process. So one thing I did think about is picking one of the advanced features or one of the stretch features and building that out in the session so you can see how you might approach one feature on its own rather than whilst you're making the posts also doing comments and reactions. Instead you do core posts and then you do feature reactions, feature comments, and those things should be quite separate from each other. So that's one thing we could look at. We did have quite a lot of conversation about like rendering HTML, manipulating HTML, when's the right time to use inner HTML, when's the right time to use document create element, and maybe is there something else that is easier to use or more enjoyable to use than both of those without the security risks. There is lots to show you there. I don't want to do that for the whole session because it's quite a lot of research for just one question. But I can show you how HTML templates work and how custom elements work. And I think that in a year or two, maybe 3 years from now, JavaScript is going to have matured to the point where we can use custom elements, HTML templates, and something very similar to inner HTML really smoothly and flawlessly. But I can tell you as of the time of writing, we're not there yet. It's still a little bit clunky. There's still stuff that you have to do that if you're reading the file and you've never experienced this kind of thing before, you're suddenly reading like shadow DOM, like dealing with the shadow DOM and mode open, and it doesn't really make sense unless you study how the browser works. So that's why it's not in JS1, and it's still a little bit too immature to be in JS2, but I'll show you anyway. Right, so I actually didn't get that many questions in the channel. I'm going to just plug my external screen in here so I can keep Discord open. Okay, I don't think that's going to work today. Well, oh, there we go. Problem solved. Okay. All right, so Q&A session with no questions is going to be fairly quick and not very useful. So someone has to start me off in the chat, something you've been wondering about or something that is in the CA that's is there a trick to doing this? Is there a trick to doing that? These are the kinds of questions I'm expecting to answer in this session, and I don't have a specific set of content that I've prepared beforehand. So if you want, we can pause for a while and let questions come in and do this a little bit more asynchronously. Mhm. Sure. Okay. Okay. Cool. Yeah, that's a good question. Um, so these things are very closely related, but there's they are three different issues to tackle. So I'm going to do them a little bit separately at first. I just need to get my project set up here. Oh, and sometimes VS Code just doesn't want to access. Um, Sometimes it doesn't access Finder for some reason, so I can't actually like use it to open a folder. There we go, that's better. We're going to go demos. Where are demos here? I think you have your own group, and you even have JS2 already. So let's just reuse this environment that I had from before. It's got some stuff in there already. I will build out from scratch, but maybe we just keep that stuff. In fact, no, I'm gonna get rid of it all. We're gonna do that totally from scratch. All right, so an example API call, I think maybe the best one to demonstrate is a put, because in a put it's probably the most complicated. In fact, let's do two. We'll do the easiest and we'll do the hardest. So the easiest one is delete, in my opinion. Um, there's fewest things to consider when doing a delete call. It's almost the exact same thing as doing a get call. And then with put, there's a couple of extra things to consider, so we can use that as a more advanced example. So I'm going to create this structure for my files. I'm going to have an API folder, and then we are going to have posts, and this is going to be update.js, and we'll do the same thing for delete. Or actually, I could call my file delete, and I can't call my function delete. That's the problem. If I try to say export function, my code installation appears to be corrupt. Please reinstall. I have never seen that before. Um, that's interesting, and none of the extensions are working. Uh, okay, that seems to be fixed now. Um, yeah, there we go. I don't know what that was about. So if I am writing like export async function delete, it's not a very good idea, because as the error here says, delete is a reserved word, um, and that's because we use delete to, if we have like an object test and we have one property called, yeah, name is fine, we can use delete to say delete test.name. So it's in the same way that like const and async and var and let and of and for and while, these are all keywords in JavaScript. So you can never name a variable or a function or anything using one of these words, and delete is one of those words. So I would not call this function delete. I would call it remove maybe instead, because that's not a keyword. And because I like to have my file name matching the name of the function that it is containing, then I would avoid calling this file delete, but that's what it's going to do. Okay, so we know that we need our token. Also just want to get Copilot off. Is that off now? So we know that we're going to need our token, and that's going to be a string. And then we are going to have our fetch options, which we know is going to be an object. And we're going to have the response, and that's going to be, I cannot spell today. We have the response, which is going to be await fetch something, but we don't necessarily know the URL or exactly what's going to happen. So here what I'm just trying to do is sketch my way through the function instead of trying to make it all work at all times. I find it a bit easier to sort of make a rough idea of what's going to have to happen and then fill in the blanks afterwards. You don't have to do it this way. This is just something I think is going to be helpful for demonstration. So once we have our response, then this is a delete function. So we don't really need to do anything with the response, because the response at the most is going to say you deleted something. There's no data to handle. So you don't really need to return anything from this function. So in this case, we actually we could stop the function there at response. We might just want to check that response was okay, i.e. if this response is not okay, that means that there was an error trying to delete something. So we might not want to tell, inside this function we have two possibilities. Something was deleted successfully and something was deleted unsuccessfully. And we probably want the user to know if what they did was a success or not. So we don't need to return response JSON, because there's probably not going to be any useful information there. It's not going to hurt, so I can leave it like that. It's not going to hurt anyone if we're not using that information or if that information is not useful. And this is typically how another type of request would work, because you do want to return the data that you're getting from fetch once you're done. So what happens here is going back to this question here about error handling. And from this point onwards, you are in a place where every developer is going to have their own opinion on how to do this. So what I'm showing you is my way of doing this. This is not the only way. Some developers would return this if there's an error. So you wouldn't necessarily know, it wouldn't show up in a try catch if there was an error. So all I'm going to do is say, if the response was not okay, I'm going to throw a new error, and I'm going to say, could not delete this item. So this function has no try catch block. It just has the raw material needed to send one request. We can fill in the blanks here. Some of them are easy to fill in. So the easiest one to fill in is method, because that's going to be delete. And we don't have to worry about, so in headers, we don't have to worry about authorization, because, sorry, we do, we definitely do. So I'm going to put that there. What we don't have to worry about is content type, because you only need to worry about content type when you're sending a body, i.e. if you're sending a post request or if you're sending a put request. If you're not sending a body, you don't have to worry about the content type header. In fact, if you do use the content type header and then you don't supply a body, it could cause an error on the API, because the error is expecting to see a JSON object or a JSON string, and in actual fact it's getting null, and it attempts to convert null into real JSON, and it fails in the exact same way that JSON fails if you give it the wrong input in your browser. All right, so these options in the previous video, or the long video that I did, I had a system to take care of these options. So I had like an auth fetch function. That's something I find convenient. It is not a requirement. It's just one way to approach this. If you find it easier to be explicit and to write out exactly what the options are going to be for each request, that's absolutely fine. It's not about copying exactly what someone else has done. It's about understanding why they made those decisions in the first place. So I would hope that by now everyone has figured out how to set JWT headers. It's a very, very important part of this CA. The token here is obviously invalid because it's a blank string. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say local storage.token. This is the same thing as saying local storage get item token. Almost the same thing. This will always return, sorry, this I think can return, anyway, that's not important here. They're slightly different, but as far as you're concerned, they do the same thing. This looks a little bit nicer to my eyes than using a method. And maybe we want to say, if there's no token, then this shouldn't happen, right? Like this process should end early. And that's really all an error is. It's a command to JavaScript to end the current function with a message. And in this case, the message would be deleting a post requires you to, let me rephrase that, you must be logged in to delete a post. Something like that. Errors, I think, is something that we don't always understand or appreciate. They're not bad. They're really, really good. The hardest thing you can possibly do in development is debug software that doesn't emit any errors. It doesn't show you any errors, because you have no way of knowing what's gone wrong and where to look, and it is like staring into a black box and trying to pick out the right pin from inside, the right colored pin, without being able to see anything. It's almost impossible. So errors are not something to be treated with, like, they shouldn't make your heart sink. They should actually they should give you hope, because every error has a solution, and hopefully an error contains a message that is going to be sort of vaguely helpful towards solving the problem. So not seeing an error when something isn't working should be more frightening to you than something not working and seeing an error at the same time. Okay, so I think we probably have everything we need here. I'm just checking it over. We haven't hooked up this, so we don't have a URL at the moment, and we haven't added options to the fetch. So the URL, I will pretend that this is a external variable that I'm importing, and I'll say API post path. And this is going to be api.snoroff.dev/API v1 social posts, I believe. Let's just check that. Yep. Okay. All right. So I just need HTTPS here to fully qualify that URL. And we're going to need the ID, and that's going to be a number. So I like to set a default value for as many arguments as I can, and there's a few reasons I like to do that. The first is that you get this nice readout here. So VS Code will do that automatically for you, and it says that ID is an optional numerical parameter. So this is like writing some JS docs. Like this has saved me having to specify what type of data ID is going to be. And I also am probably going to want some error handling here as well to say that if there's no ID, that it doesn't work. So you must pass a valid post ID. Maybe that's enough. So these are guarding against this function being used incorrectly. And in this case, we want this function to create errors if something goes wrong, because we want to know about those errors. They're very important. So we have an ID that's going to be included as an argument. Now we can form our URL, because our URL is going to be this URL plus the ID. So let's say up at the top here, we can say path, could call it URL, could call it path. It's a matter of preference. And we're going to add the ID on the end there. And now we can fetch this path with these options. I could write this differently. I could rearrange it. I could move this object in here. I could move this in here, but ultimately how it's arranged, how it's laid out is not the important part. The important part is that this is if I remove these, which are not strictly necessary, this is sort of the minimum amount of code needed to perform a safe API request. When it comes to put and post, you might have more code than this because you're going to be working on your data, your payload a little bit before you send it, maybe. But that's the sort of bare metal example. And if we wanted to use that, we would say, let's write an example listener function. So if we wanted to set up a listener, we could say example div equals query selector dot example, and we could say example div dot add event listener click, and let's say, so this also has to be async. This event handler function has to be asynchronous if we want to use await. And then we can say in here await remove, and the ID might be, so this E is actually an event. We can destructure the event to just get access to its target, and then maybe the target ID. So if we had like button ID equals 42, and then delete, how do I spell? So if we had something like this in HTML, delete post 42, we have an ID, or maybe we have a data ID instead of an ID, so that we don't run into issues around non-unique IDs. So that's probably a better idea. And in that case, that would be dataset.id instead of target.id. When you click on this item, let's give it the class of example just to be really clear. When you click on this item, the target is the element you've clicked on. Its data set contains a property called ID. The ID is 42. That's going to be sent to this method as this value here. It'll be included in the URL. It'll be checked. The token will be checked. The relevant fetch options are gathered together, and then we request that path from the API. If everything goes well on the API, we return presumably nothing, and if there is a problem, we cancel the operation and we return a meaningful message. So in this example listener, what happens if something goes wrong? At the moment, it'll be a console error. There won't be any error handling, so it's going to affect the user negatively. So we need a try-catch block in here. And we're just going to copy all of that code into the try block. And in this catch block, that error here is going to be that message, or it's going to be that message, or this message. So maybe we are going to show a different user message depending on which type of error we get back, or maybe we're just going to show error and say something generic like something went wrong. In terms of like the language of like how much detail you should give to your user, this is really a question for a user experience specialist more than a professional developer, because some developers would say that this amount of vagueness is a good thing, because you shouldn't be giving away too many secrets about how your system works in an error message. The user isn't technically minded most of the time. They don't really want to know that there was a problem parsing JSON, or there was a specific problem they don't understand. So there is a balance between kind of being simple in the way that you describe errors to the user. But if you are doing this, i.e. returning something quite vague to the user, you should also find some sort of way to omit that error that you did catch. So it should go into the console in this case. You could use console.error, but considering that you have handled it, like if you've handled an error, it's no longer an error anymore. So it's a little bit weird to handle an error by then displaying something as if it's an error. You've chosen to reduce this error from being something that's going to interrupt JavaScript, and so it's now more of a warning than it is a real error. I don't know if that makes any sense, but a warning doesn't interrupt the application. Something's gone wrong, but it hasn't ruined your day. Okay, so just checking up on the comments here. My external monitor is not working. When should we use throw, error, or try catch? I would say that the API function should be ready to throw errors, because it's doing something important. It's communicating with a server, and there's lots that can go wrong in that process. And we want to know about errors here. This is a listener. This is designed for the user. We are using or consuming this function here, but all of this code exists so that we can display HTML, and we can listen to user interactions, and we can have that conversation with the user. Because we're having that conversation, that's when trying and catching becomes more important. The user doesn't want their experience to stop. They want their experience to be fluid and to continue, and that's what a catch block does. It prevents an error from stopping the operations of the app. I can show you an example. Maybe in the browser is the best place to do this, because then we have a live environment. So if I make something very repetitive, so it's going to be something like console log 1 to etc. Right? Something like this, and yeah, I'm sure I could refactor this or do it with an array, but that's not what I'm trying to do here. So if this is a function, so all of these are happening inside the function. Obviously, if I run this function, it's going to give us exactly what we expect. If I change this function and I throw a new error, now when I run this function again, I get as far as 1, and then I have my uncaught error, test error, please ignore, which is clearly what I've written here. Why would we want to do that? I mean, if I keep going with the example, and I move, oh, okay, I've lost it. If I keep going with this example and I move the error down here, here we go. Now we get as far as 4, and we see the error again. Why would we want to break JavaScript intentionally? The answer is only if we know that we're going to be catching errors somewhere else. So if you do this and you're not using any try-catch blocks, you're going to give yourself new headaches and you won't have a real way to solve those headaches. If you're using this in partnership with try-catch, then what you are effectively doing is, inside your function, you are making it harder to use. But because you've made it harder to use, it's way more reliable. If I took these two out, suddenly I can try that, I can try that, I can try like something like this maybe. It opens up cases where the function itself might be used incorrectly. Whereas if I keep those examples, so if I have these error gates or checkpoints, and now I try to do these again. Oh dear, okay. So if I try to do that again, now I'm going to get an error. And I want that to happen. The reason I want that to happen is because it doesn't make any sense deleting a post with no ID, because we can't build this URL. So if you've ever seen /null or /undefined and spent a long time trying to work out what's going on the API, this prevents that from happening, or at least it prevents the API request from being sent if the details in the function are not correct. So why do I do this? More control. It gives me way more control. And errors are a good thing. We like errors. Okay, shall I go on to the put request? I don't know, Rohit, if you want to just chime in on whether that was sufficient information for what you're looking for or not, if you still have questions. Okay. All right. Okay, cool. Well, let's go through put request then. So a lot of this is going to be very similar. So I can get away with starting off by just copying and pasting. I'm going to take all the demo code out of there as well. So um, I'm starting off with something very similar to the delete request, because generally speaking, API requests are quite similar. We only change one or two aspects of them depending on the situation. So there's only so many shapes that this can take, and the chances are that if we've done a good job with one API function, we can carry that structure across to another API function, as long as we make sure that we go through every single line and update. So in this case, we have two um, arguments now instead of just having the ID, because when you're deleting or when you're getting a record, all you need is the ID, because in the case of a get, we don't know the data for the post. We are asking the server for that data. We're supplying the server with an ID, and the response contains that data. With delete, we don't care what the data is because we want to remove it anyway, so it's irrelevant. We just need to tell the server which ID, which post ID is the one that should be deleted. And with post and put, you need the ID. Well, actually, with put, you need the ID and the data that you want to change for the post, which is what makes it the more complicated of the four that we handle. So this second argument is going to be post data. You could call this new post data, because this is the data that's going to be replacing the old post data on the server. Our token code is going to be the exact same thing. The path code is going to be the exact same thing, because if you look at the documentation, we have, so we've just been looking at this delete path here, and if we look at the put path, it is identical. So there's no changes we need to make to how we are building the path here. It's just the only thing that's different is the HTTP verb that we are using. So those two are fine. I'm going to keep this in place because, as you said, Rohit, like if you are struggling to define this ID value, and I will go through how we do that in a second. If you had this little block of code, you would never even try and request like post/null, because this would stop the function at that point. So I find this to be very helpful, especially when trying to debug. Creating more errors actually helps you narrow down what's going wrong quicker. This one is fine. And then in terms of options, we have some new information here. So our method is changed to put. We're going to keep our authorization header, and we're going to add the content type of application JSON. And we also need to include the body, which it would be very nice if we could just do this, but that's not the case. So to explain why this can't be a real object, why we have to use JSON.stringify, you need to think about what the internet is. The internet is like a telephone cable, and it only sends one piece of information at a time. It happens to send billions of those pieces of information at once, or in very short succession. So that's why it feels like it's doing something different, but it's only sending one chunk at a time. And what this means is that everything that we send from A to B on the internet has to be sent in a straight line. So if you have like a image file, that image file has to be something, you have to be able to break it down to one single number at some point, and then you're just sending the number over the internet. It's the same thing with text. Text is just a number, right? Like every letter has a Unicode number assigned to it, so you could take this sentence and you could turn it into one very long number. And this is how computers think, and this is how computers communicate with each other. So we have to send body as a string because there's not actually any other physical way there's no other way to send data. All data is ultimately a string, and all strings are ultimately numbers. So we have to be in control of the encoding of that string, and this function, its job is to encode data. So if we could encode this as XML, we could encode it as GraphQL. There's lots of different types of application encoding, but because we're in JavaScript land, we like to use JS2, JavaScript object notation. So as much as I would love just to send the body as an object and never have to think about that again, it's not going to happen, and we have to stringify this body object before we send it. So at this point, this is a potential source of trouble because it's an object, and if the user or the developer could attempt to send the wrong properties. So if I'm just making an example here, I could say update post 42, and then I could include an object here and say like banana true, and that's not a valid property of a post object. So that's a potential source of misuse. If you wanted to, you could create a similar error region down here and say, if post data, if you don't have a title or something like that, then throw a new error. But I'm not going to do any more of that. Here I'm assuming that the user or the developer is going to supply an appropriate set of data to update an item, and if they don't, it will more or less be guaranteed to end up here, because this response is going to come back bad. It's going to come back as response probably response 400. So it'll say that the request was malformed because I've used the wrong properties for the object. So a lot of this code is just here to catch those edge cases. I know these edge cases very well because I have been dealing with APIs and fetch for a long time. It's not necessarily obvious, this stuff. This is a pattern, not the pattern. So this is not the only way to handle this task. This is the pattern that I've found most useful to me in my career, and it does involve this, and I'm fairly unique or rare in the sense that I use errors a lot in my own code. Not everyone likes to do that. So you could strip all of those away and find a different way to alert the user to an error if you choose, but this is the kind of like rigor and robustness that I like to have in my code. So I mean that's the update function. We can test it, test them out and see if they work. I'm pretty confident they will work, but I may have made a mistake somewhere or other. We will talk about like where the ID comes from and how to sort of track that, how to manage that. Just going to check comments quick. Okay, I'll get to that question, Richie, in a second. It's a good one. Okay, yeah. All right, I'm just going to make a little test file and import that. So could you throw an error and stop your code in the finally block? I don't think that is a good idea. Um, so just to sketch that out, that would look like this. Try, catch, and then finally. Um, I don't think it would be a good idea to throw an error inside here. Um, I don't think that would take you back to catch because finally runs after these two. So if you have an error here, if you have new error, that will come through to the catch block. But if you add this here, I don't think that's going to come back here. I think that's going to throw, I think that will throw this whole function. So the answer is no, and the reason is I'm not 100% sure, but it's confusing, and if it's confusing to try and predict what's going to happen, then it's probably not a good idea to use it. This finally block, I've only ever really found one useful thing for it. So if you have like a loader, so maybe we want to say const loader equals query selector and say .loader. So I'm just writing some pseudocode in here. So we're going to do some API stuff. If that fails, we're going to show an error message to the user. And then finally, loader.classlist.remove active or loading or whatever it is, whatever class you're using with your CSS to animate the loader. That's the most useful thing I've found finally can do. It can be useful if you're debugging because you can do something like this, where you can say console group. And then in the finally block, you can have group end. And then that'll just visually group stuff together for you in the console. So it's not useful for the user. It's just something that is occasionally useful for a developer whilst they're debugging. But yeah, I wouldn't put too much in finally. Normally it's just a sort of reset or some sort of visual state to reset at that point. Okay, so the original purpose of this file was to test these two functions out here. So I'm going to import them both to the file. I've got update and I've got remove. So first I need to go onto the social API and make sure that I have a post that I can actually do or delete. It belongs to me. Post to delete. Okay, this post has the ID of 717. So my test is going to look something like this. We're going to have try catch. We're going to await remove post to delete. And if there's an error, the test failed. If there's not an error, the test succeeded. Right now, this will fail because I'm not logged in. I don't have a token. I don't even know if there is an HTML file. But I'm going to pretty much get rid of everything now. So I need to, I'm actually, for the sake of expedience, I'm going to cheat and I'm just going to hard code my my token because the purpose of this is not to show JWT flow. We've done sessions on that before. So instead, I'm going to just say local storage set item token, and I'm going to give it my token. So please, all of you watching, please don't manually transcribe the string you see here and use it to misrepresent me on the social API. I would hate if that happened. But with this as a little temporary measure, we should be able to access that again here. So now I should have the level of authorization that I need to run this function. And if we go live, should see a nice blank page. And in the console, did I actually, yes, I did, test, and it's called here. 404, okay, I didn't, so the errors I've got are import errors. So it's saying that they're looking for a file and it's 404ing, and that is because I did not qualify these with the file name. So I forgot to add .js, and if we clear this and come back, that is because that error is because I was writing HTML in a JavaScript file, which is not very good. So delete that example code that I should have deleted earlier, and here we go, test failed. So we've got 404, post not found. So that probably means that my test did work, but I've now deleted the page. So I need to do that more slowly next time. So let's try that again. New delete post. This one has the ID of 718, and I'm gonna do this really slowly. We're going to change the test ID. You can see there's two requests here. And if we go to the console, we have 2 tests succeeded. I don't actually know why that happened twice. Maybe something to do with live server. I'm not sure. But if I try that again, it was now going to say test failed because we are. That's why. So it was happening twice, by the way. It's worth talking about. It's happening twice because inside the test file, I was calling the test function, and I was also calling the test function here. So it was happening twice because I was asking for it to happen twice. It's not some sort of sick game that the computer is playing on me. Okay, so that works. I think that is fairly definitive. Update we can test as well. I need to create another post to do that. So this is going to be test updates, and I'm not going to include any extra data. I'm just going to include the title, so we can add that stuff in later. And our example is now 719, and this time we're going to be doing a little bit more than just providing the ID. We're going to provide a body, or not a body. We're going to provide a post data object with our new values. So our new title can be "It worked." And we can add a body for the first time saying okay, my imagination is a little bit tired at this point. Tests. Okay, so we could add media as well. Maybe we can do that. Go to lorem.pixum.photos. That's what I'm looking for. And I like the puppy, so I'm gonna take the puppy. Okay. Unlike delete, we do actually care about the response data here. So this here is quite important. And looking at this now, I also need to update some words here. And there is actually more going on that we could get into in terms of errors here, but I'll keep it like this for now. Okay, so our test function is set up to update post 719. Let's give that a go. Okay, so test succeeded, and we have one request to post 719. And if we take a look at that request, we can see what the data that we sent and the data that we received. And if I update on my client, there's a puppy with our new title, with our new body, with the tag, and with the image we provided. So we can keep doing this. So we can add a new tag, and we can change the ID here to something random, and change that, add some stuff here, and run it again, and we should see again, test succeeded. And if we update here, things have changed, and we've got a new image of cliffside in what looks like Cornwall or Wales in the UK. So that's covering the nuts and bolts. That's covering the process of hitting the API. But there's other things like tracking this ID, gathering that post data, those are all user interaction tasks. So in the case of ID, there's a question about how you're passing state around in your application, i.e. it's more of an HTML thing than it is a JS thing. I'll show you an example. So if we have div class posts, and then within that we're going to have div class post, and we'll have stuff like title and all of the stuff you would imagine, but we're going to have buttons as well. Delete, and we're going to have update and view, so on and so forth. Maybe comment. And we're going to have a few of these post objects or post items. The best thing you can do is include the ID here. The reason for that is that in HTML, information travels down, travels from parent to child. Events travel from child to parent. So when you click on this button, the only thing you really need to know about this button is what is it for? And if the answer is delete, you know that you've clicked on a button that is meant to delete something. Since the event is going to travel upwards through the HTML hierarchy, its next stop is going to be this element, its parent element, and in this case, its parent element has an ID. So we don't necessarily have to put the ID in here as well and have that repeated for every single button, because we're in the right place already and the parent has that information already. So we can replicate that for all of these. And in some of these cases, they might not need to be a button. So for view, that is actually something that we can represent quite nicely with with an anchor tag, because we are probably going to have a posts page. So it could be posts like this, or it could be post.html. I'm going to go with the post folder, and we can include the ID like that. That can be a bit repetitive. It works because you, when you click on this link, you've encoded the ID into the URL, so it's very easy to get that data. If I update my example a little bit, I can make a little mini function, get ID, and it's going to be a new URL using location, window.location, and you're going to return URL.searchParams get ID. Okay, so how do you get the ID? Now the way to get the ID is using that function. So when you are testing, you can say, instead of hard coding, you can say just get the ID. And now if I go back to my test page, we should have, if I clear this, we should have test failed, because I'm trying to update a non-existing ID. But if I put in here 718, was that not the correct 719? Okay. So I put 719 in my ID, and now test succeeds because I'm passing this number from my browser URL bar into the script here, and this function is picking it out of the URL, it's returning it to this variable, and then I'm using that as part of my update function. So the trick is having that data to hand. One thing that I've seen that I quite like is actually storing your post item as a form. So your form is going to have the class of post. It's going to have the, does it have an ID? I don't think it needs an ID. So you have a, maybe the action is the ID. The amount of times I turn Copilot off and it just doesn't turn off. What am I doing here? You can have a different action. That's what I'm trying to get at here. Buttons can have a special attribute, which I can't remember off the top of my head what it's called. Button action URL. There's a way to set the action on the button instead of on the form, which I don't really use, which is why I'm looking it up. Form action, that's it here. Okay. So you can add form action, and then you might have like delete in there. You have one input, so this can be a hidden input that contains the ID, the name ID, and the value. So in this case, let's say 42. And when you click this button, it will get. Let's try this out. Okay, let's try that little example out. So we have our simple form, and when I press the button, the URL changes. So ignore this error because that's not what I'm demonstrating. What I'm demonstrating is that the URL has just been updated, and it's been updated quite nicely if we look at that. If we do one of these for edit, and change that to edit, and view, and let's add post in there as well. Okay, so now we have this little very simple thumbnail, it would be, and if I click on edit, it's going to take me to post/edit, and then with the ID encoded quite nicely for me there. You would then need a page at this location to pick up that ID and render the post, which I don't have in this example. But that's quite a nice little trick. There's not actually anything wrong with that. As long as you have the page to match it, that's fine. And I had a typo there, so it should just look like that. There's not actually any visible input fields. It's just these buttons, and let's change that. There we go. So there's quite a few good questions in the chat here. So far, we've looked at two of the API calls. We've looked at some error handling and done some error handling theory. A little bit of like ID API or state handling is really what it is, like managing state. So local storage, like all of this stuff fits into this category. You've got local storage, you have URL state. Like one thing I will say, particularly in regards to this example, this URL is an object in the same way that it's a string, but it's also an object. This form is an object, and the data in this form and the data that goes into that URL is the same thing. These are all just different ways of representing the same information, and at different times like the URL bar is one tool we have, local storage is another tool we have, and these are both tools for the same thing, which is storing state. What I mean by state is, like, if you're on a shopping, like an e-commerce site, your URL might say shop, category, shoes, men's shoes, and then maybe like brand, Nike, and that's probably as far down as you're going to go with the URL, but you might have search equals gold because you want a gold pair of men's Nikes. That is not an accident. It's not a coincidence. That's someone's design, that someone has thought carefully about how this URL should be structured and how much it should tell the user. And then based on this URL, the website knows quite a lot about what the user wants to see. That's what I mean by it's an object. This URL string is really just a way of encoding information. The information we're encoding is what we want to see. And the person we are asking is usually an API or usually a web server. So we're requesting information from a web server. This is the words we're using to make that request. And hopefully we see something relevant to us. Otherwise, we're probably going to see a 404 page. And that is a key part of making a request, and it's a key part of understanding a form. In this example, everything after the question mark corresponds to an input with that name. So if I change this name to example and we try that again, now ID is changed to example. And since you are the one, so if I expand this, you would have many of these, and you would have more than, like, you'd have like a H1. No, this, okay, that's not looking great because I don't have any CSS at all here, but this would be your thumbnail. You'd have your image here as well. I'm going to pull this image. You know, this is meant to be representing your thumbnail for your items, like very roughly speaking. And these are representing the buttons that you would otherwise use an anchor tag for. I'm not suggesting everyone rushes off and changes their project to use a form in this way. I just think it's a nice way to show that link between the data in a form, what a form is, and the way that a request works. These things are all intensely closely related to each other. So we've talked about state management, and we could go into more detail there, but I'm going to leave that for now. We've got search bar filter, and then we had also a question which was related to that. So that question was, how much should we use the API to sort and filter content, and how much should we use the JavaScript methods of doing the same thing? So for example, if we have a button on our site, let's just create a little HTML example here. We have a form, which is going to be called sort, and we're going to have, I suppose, like a drop down, and that's going to be sort by, and then we can have some options in here. Sort by oldest, newest, most reactions, or something like that. Okay, so we have a very simple form. We can select oldest, newest, most reactions, and we can click sort. And when we do that, we're going to have the our choice represented in our URL. There are two ways to go now. So we are imagining that we've got a list of posts here, and I can get a list of posts if we create the right function for it, which we can do very quickly. Read. Okay, that's probably fine. So if we do in our test function, let's use this to so I'm just refactoring things a little bit to make them simpler. And the test function, I'm just going to grab, actually I need a list of posts. I don't need a single post, so let's do this. And we no longer need that because this is going to be enough. And that should not be there. Okay, I think that should give us a list of posts. Let's try that out for size. Doesn't seem to do anything. So this, in terms of like going back to error handling, because I've handled this error, all I see is test failed. I don't actually see what went wrong. So that's what I was warning about earlier, where by handling errors in the wrong way, sometimes you can deprive yourself of useful information. So if I turn this off and I actually log the error that I was supposed to see, now I can see a much more useful bit of information. I can see that ID is not defined, and it's not defined on tests on read line 6. So it's right, because I have error handling stuff that doesn't make any sense. So I can now get rid of that. Now test succeeded, and if I check network, I'm getting my nice list of tests down. So I just want to create a simple bit of UI for each element so we can sort them and look at approaches to sorting them. So I'm just going to do this very simply, posts for each post, and I'm going to yeah, I'm going to do a hybrid approach here. So hopefully I'll make everyone unhappy and everyone happy at the same time. I'm going to use both in HTML and create element at the same time. So I have a template. In fact, I am going to actually stick to what I did earlier. So I'm going to use this form. That's going to be my template. And yeah, it's going to be inner HTML. Because so far, I haven't touched anything from the API. I'm just trying to think about this. Okay, that's going to be blank as well. So in fact, I'm going to leave out everything that is dynamic, and I'm also going to make this its own function. So I'm going to call this something with a better name. Function creates post thumbnail. And what we could do is, using this template, we could use this to create some real HTML, and then once the presentation side is done, we can change the values that are being dynamically loaded from the API afterwards. So how do we do that? Well, there's a kind of a quick way to do it. We could use DOM parser, or we could const div equals document create element, and we could insert this text into the div, and then we could get it back out of the div again, right? Which seems a really weird thing to do, but that's essentially what you're doing every time you insert an element directly into the document using an HTML, which is why I don't really like it. So in this case, we're going to be looking for .post, and then at this point we actually have, it'll be a form. So we can say form equals, and at this point we have a real form, as if we created this whole thing using create element. So we can say form.querySelector. Oh, I suppose I deleted. Okay, let me put that back. We can say form query selector h1 inner text equals post data dot title. So if you really want to use inner HTML and you really want to use it safely, this is how you can use it safely. The one thing we're not doing here is this. That's the dangerous part. It's not that anything else in here is specifically a problem. It's that we don't know exactly what postdata.title is going to contain. It might contain hello world, or it might contain a script tag. And if it contains a script tag, we're just going to be entering that directly into our HTML document without really checking. If we try and do that here, so if I have something dangerous that I'm trying to enter here, this will stop it. So that's the main reason that there's a problem with inner HTML. This is getting kind of complicated, but it would be just as complicated as if I had lots of create elements, right? Like I could have said like form and then added the classes to here, class list.add, and then we'd add the class list posts, and form.method equals get, and we can describe everything about each one of these elements using this syntax. We don't always have to. The important part is that we're not directly inserting content into the template. And I can do the same thing with body using the p tag, and we can put an empty image in there as well. In fact, I think maybe image source is okay. So I think that is probably not a risk. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that I don't think there's really an opportunity for too much to go wrong there. I guess someone could terminate the image tag early and then do something. Yeah, maybe that might be a risk. It might not be a risk, but just to show these two ways of doing things. We then have return form. So this function is like a little factory. It eats post data and it spits these forms populated with the right data for the post. It was a little bit longer of an example than what I intended, but there you go. So now we can say for each post, return one of these. So I can say post thumbnails, and that's going to be an array of these forms. What do I do with an array full of forms? I can say document body append post thumbnails, I think. All right, so if that works, kind of, that's weird. So it's actually showing my JS. That wasn't what I was expecting to see. How did that happen? I'm gonna try this with DOM parser. I'm really not sure how I did that. I don't have any idea. I've managed to expose the actual like JavaScript function. Like there's a name for this. It's like a tween. So I accidentally did a tween, which is like kind of like an artistic coding thing where you get a function to read its own source code out, but I didn't do that on purpose. So yeah, instead I'm gonna use DOM parsers to do the same thing. So I've got my template here, and I'm gonna say new DOM parser. I realize this is getting way more complicated than it should be, but part of this is to show you that there are different ways of going about this. So now form is going to be parsed from string, and then we have our string, which is called template, and we are using text HTML, except that's going to be a document, and our form is actually going to be inside that document. Query selector form. What's wrong? Oh, there we go. Let's see if that also reads itself out. Maybe that's the problem as well. There we go. Okay, so it actually, the change I just made there that wasn't really relevant. That wasn't actually the issue. I'll change it back to show you how it was before. It was a syntax issue, so it's this here. That's what was not working because that was returning the function rather than the product of the function. So now we've got it sorted. So we have our demo content that we can now sort and search and stuff like that. Okay, so, and you can see as well, if I change this, if I add the post data in there, when I click on one of these, I'll get the I'll get the right URL, 712, and this one 706. So that will be useful for me later on. Okay, so sorting. The point of the question was that there's two ways to do it. We have the data that we're holding in memory. That's this. It's an array, and we can manipulate that array. Just because we manipulate that array does not mean that the HTML we've used it to render is going to change on its own. So whenever we're sorting, we have two jobs to do. We have to sort the data, then we have to re-render our list. In terms of pros and cons of sorting locally versus sorting remotely, sorting remotely is more reliable. It's more likely to give you the correct answer, but it's going to take longer, typically. And the reason it's going to take longer is because each time you change your mind about what you want to sort, you have to request a new URL. So let's find an example of that. So where should I write this? If we go to the docs and we go to the get posts endpoint, we have these parameters here. Sort and sort order. Sort can be many things. You could sort by the last updated, the created date. You could sort by the alphanumerical title, body. There are lots of different things to sort on, depending on what you're trying to do. And you can just specify it in the API, but you have to wait for that API response to come back to you before you can use that information, before you can re-render the page and show the user that output. So I'm thinking of like major websites. If we jump onto like Amazon and we want to change these filters here, you can see there's that delay. And what's happening during that delay is that a new request is being sent to the API with my new choices. And a new list of products is being sent back and re-rendered. So this is not happening in JavaScript. This type of sorting is happening remotely on the API. And the reason Amazon would choose to do that is because they've got hundreds of thousands of products, and that's too many to fit in memory. So with the social media API, there's also potentially thousands of posts. Even though the limit is 100, there's nothing to stop you from buffering past that limit. So realistically, we shouldn't store more than 1,000 objects. Sort of, that's not a hard rule, but I would say if you're storing more than 1,000 objects in memory, you are probably going to start running into shortages at some point, i.e. the application will start to become slow, clicking things, there'll be a delay before something happens, even if it's not requesting data. Sometimes the browser will lock up and the window will crash. And these are typically all memory issues where you're storing so much JSON that there's not really enough kind of space available, and the browser process starts to choke up. So sorting on the API is fine, but sometimes you want like a really quick result. So if speed is the aim, or let me put it this way, if I've searched for like posts about coding and I have 30 results, and then I sort those 30 results, I know that I want to just change the order of the 30 I have. So there's not really much point in going back to the API and getting that information again, because the user is trying to sort the data they already have in front of them. I don't know if this is making sense, but there's a convenience aspect to it. It's like you have to make this choice for your user. This is part of your job as a developer, is what makes sense in this situation, what doesn't make sense. Does it make sense for the user to wait 30 milliseconds or 50 milliseconds every time they want to change the sort? Or can I do this with 1 millisecond delay instead? If the cost of doing it the quick way is that not all of the data is being shown, for example, like when you're sorting locally, you're only going to be sorting that 100 or 200 posts that you have in memory. If you're sorting on the API, it will take all of the posts, sort all of them, and return you the first page. So they are going to be doing different things because your application can't access all of the posts at once. So the answer is, it depends. There's definitely a value to local sorts. I'll write a quick one now. So we have function sort posts, and we're going to have a list of posts to sort, and then we're going to have the sort key and sort direction. So we need the list of posts because this is going to start with posts.sort, I think, which that should make a certain amount of sense. Then we have a sort function. So this is a function comparing A and B. And a sort function must return the difference between A and B. And the difference must be a number. How do we calculate the number? Well, these are two objects, right? Like it's post A and post B. We have to subtract one from the other. So we can't subtract an object from another object like that, because that doesn't make any sense. We can only subtract numerical or numerical-like values. So one thing that is numerical-like is the date. So we could have the updated, is it updated or is it updated date? Let's see. Created updated. So we could use that date to sort on. That would look something like this. Where, like, in the same way, you know, I said earlier in the session, everything boils down to a number. Every string can be turned into a number. A date is also just a number. It's the number of milliseconds since 1970, January 1st, 1970. So you can subtract one date from another, and the result, the answer to date A minus date B is the number of milliseconds between those two dates. Since we're sorting, what we're saying here is if this result is negative, is positive, move A up and move B down, and if it's negative, move B up and move A down. I find this stuff really difficult to juggle in my brain. Like I find a sort function for some reason doesn't fully, I can't like picture it in the same way I can picture other things in computer science. So I have full sympathy that this is like a bit of a weird a weird thing to look at, and it's quite hard to explain why it is, what's actually happening below the surface as well. Luckily, I don't have to do that. That's something you do in a computer science degree. But the important part is that this sort function is going to reorder the posts, and it's going to reorder them based on that date. We could use the title or lots of different things. And you have here sort key, sort direction. So we could replace, if we were making like a universal sort function, we could say post A and then use that key minus post B sort key. But I'm actually not going to do that. And if we were using the sort direction, we could change this operator or bit flip the results to change the direction. But I'm actually going to exclude that because we're already pretty short in time and there's still more questions to answer. So all that this is going to do is return the result of that sort. It's not actually going to re-render any of these. It's just going to change the direction of the actual array. So when demonstrating this, I need to do that. So I've got posts, draw the thumbnails, append those thumbnails to the document, and then we're going to need some sort of listener. We've got our form here, so we can set a listener there. Let's check what I called it. Okay, I called it form class sort. So I'm going to say sort form equals document query selector form.sort, and I'm going to add an event listener, and we have a event function, and in here we just want to sorted posts equals sort posts, and then we can run this again. So const sorted post thumbnails, and then we're going to swap this for the sorted posts so that we're creating our new HTML using the right data source, our newly reordered list, and then we can do this again. In fact, we need to do something else before that. We need to clear. So this is not the only way to do that, but it is what I'm going to do right now. So just to make sure this is all working, how else would we prove that this is working? Well, we could take the original posts list and take a random number, and then we could look at that same result after sorting. And hopefully these two don't match, just as a very quick test. Okay, so when I submit this form, Actually, I need to add event.prevent default to stop that from refreshing the page. Okay, so now when I submit this, we had a re-render. Things changed around. And if we look at these two tests examples, it was 682 and now it is 633. So our sort behavior might not be what we want, but the sort itself does work, and we can try that again. So that's the first post by default, and when I submit, now the order has changed, and I don't actually know. There we go. So I think I actually sorted the wrong way around. I sorted by oldest to newest, which is what I was saying, like how my brain doesn't quite understand sort functions. You would need to basically swap these around. So this would be sort post oldest to newest specifically, like that. To do the same thing on the API, we would simply fetch this URL, and we would add query parameters to it. So we could add, as well as our flags, we can add sort equals updated, and sort order is going to be descending. So if I do that, okay, ascending. So that query string is effectively doing the same thing as this sort function, except this is happening on the server and this is happening in memory. That's the main difference. As to when you choose to do one or the other, it's always going to be up to you, unless there's like a strikingly obvious reason not to do it one way or to do it the other way. There's always going to be a degree of gray area where you'll have to make that choice for yourself. Okay, we've got search bar. So search bar is pretty similar. It's in the same sort of neck of the woods as a sort, because you have the same series of tasks that you need to perform. You need to take an array of data. You need to modify that array of data. So here we've modified the order of the array. But in the case of a search, you are going to be modifying the number of items in the array, and you're going to be eliminating the items that do not match your criteria, i.e. the search term. They don't fit the search term. So you have this two-step process again. You have changing the data, and instead of post.sort, we would use post.filter. And then once you have done that data change, you have to re-render. I could write a render function just to make this, what I've got so far, a little bit nicer. So I'm going to say render homepage, and I'm going to give that a list of posts. And we can pretty much take all of, we can take those two lines, because we're getting our thumbnails, and then we are going to clear the body. Clearing the body to make sure that we don't just continuously add things to the bottom of it, and then we're going to add things to the bottom of it. So now I can switch that for this, and I can switch this, just give it sorted posts there. And just a little bit of refactoring has made that look a bit better to me. and it's going to make it easier to do this search function. So I'm going to do a simple one, search post by title. So we've got the list of posts, and we've got the term, or the word that we want to use to search with. And here we're going to do something very similar looking to this. We're going to return post.filter. Then we have a function. That function takes a single post at a time instead of two. Instead of comparing two posts, we are just criticizing a single post at a time. And in the same way that this sort function has to return a number representing the difference between A and B, in this case we should be returning true or false. And that true or false is answering the question, should this post stay in the list? Should this specific post stay in this list? And we can say, okay, post title includes term. So that is going to give us a true or false. And it's going to give us true if it can find this string inside of this string. In reality, that's probably not going to be good enough for us, because if we compare, if we make an example here, our example equals hello world, okay, example includes hello, that's false. It's false because we have an uppercase H. But really, if we're searching, we don't want that kind of, we don't want to take things that literally. So it's a good idea to have a process of lowercasing your values. So in fact, with term, the best thing to do is just to overwrite. You can say term equals term to lowercase. And you might want to trim as well to get rid of any extra white space that is not going to be, is going to make things harder to use. And you probably want to lowercase that as well. So let's just try this out in the browser here. To lowercase includes hello to lowercase. True. Okay, and let's just trim that, why not? Doesn't hurt. So there we can search by title, but we might want to do more than search by title. We might want to have search by like everything, and in this case we're going to have to use a different approach, because we can't just return from that one expression. We're going to have to run multiple expressions. So what I would do here is I would say things to check, and I would have title, body. Let's just do title and body for now. Tags might be a bit different. And you could say things to check dot map function thing to check. And now we've just got like one of these strings, so it's either going to be title or body. Then we can run this process where we're saying, am I inside the function? No, I'm not inside the function. So I meant to put that inside here, so I have access to the post object. We can refer to the key of post, so in this case title, post.title, post.body, here we're just putting this into an array so that we can check more than one thing at once. To lowercase includes term. So now this is going to give us an array, but that's not very useful on its own. We need to return, and this is a little bit weird here, the length of the array. Actually, am I doing, let's do filter. A filter inside a filter. I think I've made this too complicated now, but for anyone interested, that's quite a common pattern where you have an array of your keys to check, and then you run over the array and you produce like a little report on all of the different keys. You can even produce a weighting score so that you can organize your posts, not just whether they match or not, but how well they match, how many fields match. Search behavior it can be really simple, or it can be unbelievably complicated. So this is a taste of things getting complicated. If you want to do something similar to this without doing a map, then you would just write them one by one, and you can say const title matches equals post.title, and go through the process of using includes like that, and then do the same for body, and same for tags, and so on and so forth. And then you can just say if title matches and body matches, or you probably want to use or here instead of and, because then it will be very, very exclusive, and you probably want this to be very, very inclusive. Return true, right? So if any of these three conditions are true, then this is true. We can also rephrase that like so. And that's how you would search on more than one property. When it comes to tags, it's a little different because tags is an object. Sorry, tags is an array. But we should be able to do the same thing and use the same function and still get a true or false result. The problem is here, if we change this, it's not actually doing quite the same thing. So when we're looking at tags in this context, it's going to be a literal match, as in you have to search for the exact name of a tag for this to work. You can't be rough. So if I do A, B, C, D, or if I do A, B, that's false. A, B, C is true. However, if I remake my post object and I give it a title, post.title.includes hello, is going to be true. So just be wary when you are using includes on a string. It is slightly different to using includes on an array. With an array, it's going to be more literal. Okay, I'm almost out of time, but I do want to talk about Richie's question here. And I am out of water again, so I'm going to be 1 minute. Actually, let me just think about how we're going to answer that, because maybe we can do this and then wrap up. Yeah, it's very important when the temperature is 37 degrees outside. Okay, so I think I'm just gonna tackle Richie's question and then we'll call that a day there. Um, so this is a big one, and I need a new file for this as well. So we're going to call this async. So one of the main pitfalls or bear traps or foot guns in this part of JavaScript is time. How to manage time. It's very, very difficult, not just in your project or in your life, but in code, it's quite difficult to manage time in code. And we do have tools for this. We have something.then that allows us to work with an unknowable future time. We have set timeout. We have set interval. And we have await. These two are the same thing, exactly the same thing. And these two are very close to being the same thing. And I'm going to try and explain the difference in a pure way that hopefully will be easy to understand. When you're using these two, so if I write an example, I didn't actually save this as a JavaScript file, that might help. So when you're using either of these, you're going to be set timeout and then function and then the time. So that's 2 seconds. Okay, and interval does the same thing, but it will continue repeating. In this case, we know exactly, not exactly as it happens, it'll be approximately, but we know exactly approximately how long this process will take. It's going to take exactly approximately 2 seconds. If we have await fetch, the time that this takes is unknowable. We cannot ever know how long that fetch is going to take. It could take 1 millisecond, or it could take until the end of the universe to complete. As developers, we have absolutely no way of predicting this. We don't even have reliable ways to measure this, and we should never try to do that. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're adjusting one of these values to make something work, you're looking at the problem from the wrong side. If you're doing this, you're trying to adjust your machine to wait for the right amount of time, but your machine is unable, you are unable to know that time, and so you can never instruct your machine how long to wait in order to solve the problem. There will always be variance. On someone's network, it'll take longer. On someone's network, it'll be faster. I am in South Africa, which means that I'm physically located quite far away from a lot of the major web servers in the world, which tend to be in North America and in Europe and in Asia. So it might take longer for my request to traverse through the internet at the speed of light, reach Berlin, and get the response, and then it has to come all the way back. If you live in Berlin, that'll be a very quick process because there's not many wires to go down to get to the server. This variance cannot be predicted, it cannot be measured or quantified, and it's best not to think about it. It's best to think about anything that's happening in the future as happening at an unknowable time. Luckily, when we await something, we don't have to be concerned with what that time is because it will take as long as it'll take. And if we sketch out an asynchronous function, we can see, so let's say console.log checkpoint, and we're going to have a few of these. Okay. What I can do is write a little test function which will be called wait. Okay, so this is like a fake delay function that we can await. So I'm going to say wait 1 second, then wait 2 seconds, and then wait 3 seconds, and so on and so forth. And if we run this, let's clear the decks a little bit. So I need to grab that. I need to go and export that. Okay, so a little bit messy this file. I'm just going to delete that for now. We've got our example function, which we should see if we refresh this again. So checkpoint A second later, and then 2 seconds after that, and 3 seconds after that. The only reason that that order of operations happens is because the await keyword blocks progress. So if you think about an error, this will stop progress. This will block progress. Once this is resolved, it will continue on until it finds another blocker. And until that blocker is finished, the next line of code can't commence. So the reality is that we never know what that value is. It's always a mystery. And we just have to let the process take as long as it's going to take. So when we're awaiting fetch, we just have to wait for as long as that fetch is going to take before it finishes, before we can do anything else. There's no opportunity to try and time it or to try and like preempt the server in that way.